button there.
Oh, do you want to mute everyone too, Linus?
Yeah, I'm about to.
Okay.
Let me start.
Hi, Jeff. All right, well, it's 12 o'clock, so why don't we get started? So thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you, Linus, for being the tech person for this call. I really appreciate it. But the way this all came about, I was doing a talk for Facebook for their corporate office last week, and I posted something on social media to see if any friends wanted to join, thinking one or two people would want to join. And I got such an amazing response, which I feel super humbled by. And so I just decided to do a separate talk for friends and people in my network. And so today I'm going to be sharing the story of Embrace, and that's a story that many of you guys might be familiar with already. So I'm going to spend the first half of this talk just talking about the innovation process that led to the creation of the Embrace incubators and the social impact that's had over the last 12 years now. And then I'll spend the second half of the talk just talking about some of the personal and the leadership lessons that I've learned along the way that I think are particularly relevant to the time of this pandemic and everything happening in our society today. So I'm just going to share my screen. And then we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. So the story of Embrace goes all the way back to 2007 when I was a student at Stanford doing my MBA. I took a class that would change the course of my life. That class was called Design for Extreme Affordability, where students from all of the different graduate programs come together to create low-cost technologies for people living on less than $1 a day. And this was my founding team, Linus, who's on this call, Nag and Rahul. Linus was doing his master's in computer science. Nag is an aerospace engineer. Rahul was doing his PhD in electrical engineering. And we were asked to develop a baby incubator that cost less than 1% of the cost of a traditional incubator, which in the US is about $20,000. So none of us had any medical background. None of us had ever designed a product before. And we're kind of scratching our heads wondering, how in the world are we going to do this? And then we were taught this design thinking process, which is a really simple but powerful process for innovation that consists of these 5 steps. So empathy is the first step. And empathy is all about how do you stand in the shoes of your customers? How do you really see things from their perspective? And I think this is the crux of great product design. I can't emphasize that enough. I think a lot of people try to go over this piece quickly, but it really is the most important part of the process. From there, you go to defining the problem. So who exactly is your customer and what's the specific need that you're trying to address? Then you ideate, so come up with as many ideas as possible, and here there's no such thing as a bad idea. And then you build those out, you rapidly prototype them, and you test them. And with that feedback, you go back and you iterate your product. And this is a nonlinear process. You go through these steps over and over again as you come up with your solution. So the first thing we did was to understand the background of the problem. 15 million preterm and underweight babies are born every year around the world. 3 million babies die in the first 28 days of their life. So that's 6 babies every minute. And one of the biggest problems these babies face is staying warm or regulating their body temperature. That's the primary function of an incubator, but incubators are not only expensive, they require constant electricity, they're difficult to operate. You're not going to find them in remote parts of the world where many of these babies are dying. Instead, what you see are situations like this. So this photo is taken from Uganda. This is a totally overcrowded neonatal intensive care unit. Every baby in here is in need of incubation, and yet you have a donated incubator sitting in the corner of the room, idle. Why? Because there's no electricity to power it, because no one knows how to use it. And if something breaks, there's no spare parts for replacement. And so even when these machines are free, they're often not suitable for these settings. And so instead, what you see are local solutions like this. This photograph is taken from India, where I lived for 4 years to get Embrace off the ground. India is home to 40% of all the world's premature babies. These are old space heaters used to warm babies. We would hear stories when we lived there almost once a month of babies being burned to death by these machines. The other most common solution are light bulbs, but in every clinic I visited, I would hear stories of light bulbs shattering over babies because of problems with circuits. So a lot of really unsafe and ineffective solutions out there. From there, we started to go into the villages, and that's where we truly began to understand the problem. So this is one of the first women I met in South India, Sujata. Sujata gave birth to her baby 2 months prematurely, went to a village doctor who told her she needed to go to a city hospital so her baby could be placed in an incubator. But that hospital was over 4 hours away, and she didn't have the money to get there. And so her baby died. And as we traveled across India, this is the story we would hear over and over again. And so we quickly came to realize that what was needed was not just a lower cost version of what exists today, but something that could be used by a mother or a midwife or be put into a village clinic, something that was portable, that could function without a constant supply of electricity. And so we went to the drawing board. These are the very first sketches of our incubators. We wanted a super intuitive design, and so we created this sleeping bag kind of interface. And then we thought, what could maintain warmth at a constant temperature without the need for electricity? And we went back to high school physics, to the concept that when something changes phases, let's say from a solid to a liquid or a liquid to a solid, that happens at one constant temperature, right? And so what if we could find something with a melting point of human body temperature and then put enough of that substance in there that that phase change would occur over many hours? We didn't know what the substance was at the time, and so we prototyped with the closest thing we could think of. This is margarine put into Ziploc bags. From there, we went to a Salvation Army and just picked up every baby-related thing we could find. I can't tell you how many scary baby dolls are still in my garage. But here we started duct taping the product together. And you can see in this first prototype, we initially had a tube running through the sleeping bag. And the idea was that you pour boiling water into that tube, and that would melt the phase change material, which would then heat the baby or warm the baby. And then someone said to us, it's probably not a great idea to put boiling water right next to a baby's head. And so we quickly scrapped that idea. Here we realized that babies in many of these countries don't wear diapers, and so we needed a material that was waterproof and super easy to clean. And with these early prototypes, we went back to the field and we tested with moms, with healthcare workers, with doctors. We learned the importance of sterility, right? That multiple babies would be using a single sleeping bag. And so we created the sleeping bag out of one single piece of fabric with limited seams on the inside where dirt could collect. Here, doctors requested a clear window for viewing the baby's breathing and color, and so we added that feature in. And I always love this story. So this is a liquid crystal display that tells the temperature of the wax pouch. And initially, this was a numeric scale that went from 30 to 40 degrees Celsius. And then as we went into villages and tested this with moms, they would say to us, we don't trust Western medicine. If you gave me a certain dosage of medicine for my baby, I would cut it in half because it's too strong. And so if you told me to keep this at 37 degrees Celsius or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, I would keep it at a little less than that because it's probably too warm. And so that led us to designing an indicator with a binary happy face, frowny face, as opposed to a numeric scale. And again, I think it's really understanding these cultural nuances that make for a great product design. When we needed to do more testing, we used our own family members. This is my nephew that I stuffed into one of the early prototypes. And it was in this way that we tested and retested hundreds of times until we came to the product that we were ready to release to the market. And so this is the Embrace Incubator. Many of you guys have seen this. We've got our little sleeping bag here with a waterproof antimicrobial fabric on the inside. And then the magic is this wax pouch back here. So this melts at 98 degrees, and we have two types of heater, an electric heater, as well as one that works off of boiling water. And once this melts, it just maintains the exact same temperature for up to 8 hours at a stretch. So you put this into the little pocket in the back there, and that creates a warm microenvironment for the baby. And that pouch can be reheated thousands of times. In 2012, after a few years of intense product development and clinical testing, we're finally ready to release the product. And I'll never forget those weeks leading up to product launch where everything that could have possibly gone wrong went wrong. from the electricity and the manufacturing building going out in the most critical moments to part of our product getting stuck in customs. But finally, we got the first product ready to send to our first customer, which is a small clinic in Bangalore. And then on the way to that doctor's office, we got a flat tire. And so the whole team got out of the car, piled into this auto rickshaw that you see here, and we delivered our very first product. And to me, this is really symbolic of what entrepreneurship is all about, which is doing whatever it takes to get to your end goal, regardless of the many obstacles that come in your way. And here is our very first customer. So the most exciting part of this journey by far has been getting this into the hands of the parents and the babies who need it the most. And one of my favorite quotes is from Paulo Coelho, who says, "When you truly believe something, the universe will conspire to help you achieve it." And I'm so grateful for all the people from so many walks of life who have come together to support this mission. In 2014, I had the chance to present our work to President Obama at the White House, and we got some great support from the Clinton Foundation that year. And that led to a meeting with the Dalai Lama, who participated in a artwork we did to raise awareness about infant mortality. And then we got a donation from Beyonce that got our incubators into 9 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And so this is just a few of the many people who have helped us to achieve our mission. And I wanted to share just a few stories of the babies who have been impacted. So this is my favorite story. This is in China. About 5 years ago, we started working with an orphanage called Little Flower Orphanage in Beijing. And a day after we delivered our product, they called us saying they had found a 2-pound baby that was abandoned on a street corner. They brought him into the orphanage, kept him in our incubator for about 30 days. And 7 months later, I got to visit the orphanage and hold this little boy in my arms. They told me it was the first time a baby of this size had ever survived in the orphanage. A few months after this photo was taken, I got an email from a family in Chicago saying they'd had adopted this little boy and were traveling to Beijing that summer to bring him home. And so here Nathan is with his new family. When he turned 2, we sent him a little incubator as a memento. And today he's 5 years old. He's so vibrant. He plays the violin, he does Taekwondo. It's hard for us to keep track of some of these babies, but Nathan lives right here in Chicago. And so it's been wonderful to just watch him grow up. This, a few years ago, I was giving a talk at Harvard, and afterwards this woman came up to me from the audience and she said, "My baby was saved by your incubator." It turned out she was working with a nonprofit in India and gave birth to her baby 2 months prematurely, took her baby to a village clinic where they had an Embrace incubator, and they immediately wrapped him up in there. And here he is a few years later, a thriving 3-year-old little boy. And then this, I'm going to play a really short video about our work in Uganda.
Anyagangeze n'isi manyine emyaka 18 ari wakanga nkora emirimo yange olutalo lunduma andumanya nimfita bodaboda ntwale mu ddwaliro nazaala abaana 2 omulenzi n'omuwala bali tebanatuuka ate batini omulenzi yalina 1.5 omuwala yalina 0.73 bwe nazaala abaana bange bali batini nnyo ndowooza nti no bagenda kufa nali nimbagamba sirina ssente bangamba nti nongende mu ddwaliro mulago mu gavumenti mu kkubo omwana wange omulenzi n'afa mwana wange omuwala bamuwe ekitande mu special care ningenda kuwumula When nakomawo kumuyonsa nimusanga mu embrace w'omu. Abasawo ne bangamba nti no embrace w'omu egenda kukuuma abaana bange nga babuguma. Bwe nakwata ku mwana wange kyali kituufu gyali abuguma. So bangamba banjigiriza okukola omwana wange kangaru keya. Bangamba nti no bwe nteeka mwana wange ku kifuba agenda kuba nga abuguma. Okumala ennaku 4 mu embrace bakisiibula. Namutuma erinnya Fortunate akuba yali mu embrace ate nga mulamu. Yebaza embrace akuba yayonera obulamu bw'omwana wange. Bagende mu maaso okutuwa embrace endala mu Uganda. Waliko bamaama bangi nga nze abaana baabwe beetaaga ebbugumu.
So those are just a few of the thousands of babies that have been impacted by our incubators. But it certainly has not been a linear path to get from point A to point B. In fact, one of my other favorite quotes is from Mike Tyson, who says, "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." And we have certainly faced many setbacks along the way. In fact, one of our biggest setbacks happened in 2014. We were doing a global distribution and financing deal with a major multinational medical device company. I had worked on this deal for about 9 months. And a week before signing the paperwork, this company fired their healthcare CEO, who was the main advocate for the deal. About 24 hours later, they pulled the plug on our financing, on the whole deal altogether. And at that point, we had about 7 days of cash left in the bank. We had taken out 2 bridge loans to get us to the finish line because we saw our future in our partnership with this company. I was absolutely devastated, and we thought we were going to have to shut down the whole company. And then a miracle happened. About 3 days into this, I sent an email to someone who I had met 9 months prior. I had attended the World Economic Forum in Davos 9 months before this. And every morning of the conference, there was a guided meditation. And I'm really into meditation. And so the first morning, I showed up, and I think 7 out of the 3,000 attendants were there. And I happened to sit next to Mark Benioff, who's the founder and CEO of Salesforce. And so I told Mark about what I was doing with Embrace. He told me he had a personal experience with a premature baby, and he was about to give $25 million to the Gates Foundation to create a global program on premature births. And so the two of us were just kind of amazed at the serendipity of us sitting next to each other. But when this happened, I sent Mark an email telling him exactly what had happened and asking for his help. And I'll never forget his response. He sent me an email back about 24 hours later and said, "Dear Jane, I will fund your company. Aloha." And I will forever be indebted to Mark for his belief in me and in our mission. But the whole thing forced us to take a step back because we had learned over the years that the economics didn't make sense for us to manufacture and distribute a single product on our own. And now in the absence of a global distributor, we had to figure out what was the financially viable business plan for us. And so as we thought about this, we came upon a core insight. We had learned over the years that babies slept really well in our incubators. We would get this feedback from doctors all over the world. And it makes sense. The incubators mimic the womb. And so with less temperature fluctuations, there are less disturbances to a baby's sleep. And so we took that insight and we launched a line of consumer products called Little Lotus. So these are swaddles and sleep sacks that have a temperature regulating function. And in our internal studies, what we discovered is that babies sleep almost an hour longer with the Little Lotus products compared to traditional swaddles in the market. And this has a 1-for-1 model. So for every Little Lotus product we sell, we help to save a baby with an Embrace incubator in a developing country. And I think this is really important because when we think about innovation, it's important to think not only about products and services, but about business models as well. So together, between the Embrace incubators and with the help of Little Lotus, we've helped to save over 300,000 babies in over 22 countries. We actually just did our latest count, and that number is up to almost 350,000 babies. And our next goal is to get this to 1 million babies, and then really to get this to every baby who needs it. So I'm going to shift gears a little now and talk about some of the most important lessons that I've learned in this journey. And as I said, I chose lessons that I think are particularly relevant during this time. So my first lesson is to let go of attachments to outcomes. And I have a quote here from one of my favorite texts, the Bhagavad Gita, which says, "The intention behind action is what matters." And I learned this through multiple instances of my company nearly shutting down, including even a more dramatic case that I'll tell you about in a moment. But after this happened, after what happened in 2014, I did my first 10-day silent meditation, and I picked up surfing around the same time. And I was just blown away by the parallels between these two things, particularly around the idea of impermanence, that everything in this world is constantly changing. And so be totally present in this moment, but also don't be attached to anything, including to outcomes. And I realized how attached to this one single outcome to Embrace's success I had become, that even the thought of the company shutting down threatened my own sense of identity. And through that, I learned one of the most important lessons of my life, which is that we are not defined by our external successes or failures, which can be arbitrary and which can be dictated by something like a global pandemic or a CEO getting fired. Instead, I think that we are defined by our values and by this journey that we choose to take. You know, it's our efforts and our intentions rather than our outcomes that truly define who we are. And so in this time of this unprecedented global pandemic where outcomes are totally uncertain and we don't know what the future is going to look like, I think it's even more important to look internally at who we are and what we stand for. And to me, that's all about, how am I acting with love? How am I growing? How am I contributing to others? So my second lesson here is to feel all your feelings. And I believe that great leaders lead from their heads, their hearts, and their guts. But it took me a long time to figure this out. I remember the first time I walked into a neonatal intensive care unit in India, I panicked. I saw multiple babies crammed into a single incubator with bugs crawling all over them. I glanced at the floor and there were 2 infant corpses in boxes. I wanted to cry, but I couldn't even breathe. And that scene would soon become my daily reality. And for the first year I lived in India, I tried to repress all those feelings of sadness and anger and fear because I wanted to be composed. I wanted to be this really strong person for my team. And then one day, I can't remember exactly what happened, but I remember I started crying in front of my team. And afterwards, I was so mortified. I was so embarrassed. But my head of operations came up to me after that, and I had a team of all men reporting to me at the time. And he said to me, "Thank you so much for being vulnerable, because when you're vulnerable, it gives us permission to be vulnerable as well." And I learned one of the most important lessons about leadership that day, which is that great leaders lead with authenticity, which requires being vulnerable. And that requires that we feel all our feelings. And I have found the best way to do this for me is through mindfulness, which to me is about becoming really aware of whatever thoughts and feelings we're having, and then just accepting those fully without judgment, without needing them to go away. And when we do this, that allows us to consciously choose a different thought rather than having these negative loops playing in our head. Research over the decades, as many of you guys know, has shown that mindfulness decreases stress, lowers blood pressure, it bolsters the immune system. When we're stressed, flight or fight mode, but that also suppresses our immune systems. So emotions are just energy and motion. Every emotion is correlated to a physical sensation, which is neither good nor bad, it just is. And research has shown that emotions last no longer than 90 seconds. And so if we can just surf the wave of an emotion over those 90 seconds as it crests and dissipates, then we allow ourselves to process whatever it is that we are feeling. So I'm going to take us through a really quick 90-second mindfulness exercise where I'm going to just count 3 mindful breaths. And then we're going to locate any sensations that might be coming up in our bodies. We're just going to accept or appreciate those sensations exactly as they are. And then we're going to match that experience with an expression. And that can be a sound or a movement, but just something to help us process that experience. So if everyone will please close your eyes. And I'll count these 3 breaths. So we're going to breathe in 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2. Breathe out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Breathe in 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2. And breathe out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And last breath, breathe in 1, 2, 3, 4. Hold 1, 2. And breathe out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now just slowly scan your body and see whatever sensations come up for you. Maybe it's a tightness in your neck or tingling in your chest, but whatever sensations are arising, just try to tune into those. And as you identify those sensations, just take a moment to breathe those in and just be with whatever sensation is coming up for you. There's no need to label or judge. No need for that sensation to go away. We're just going to fully embrace and honor whatever is coming up in our bodies. Our bodies contain so much wisdom. So just take another moment or two and keep breathing into those sensations. And then when you're ready, you can just slowly open your eyes. And then we're going to do something really fun. We're going to match that experience with a sound. So for me, I feel a little tightness in my shoulders and my neck area. And I think that sounds something like, ah. So whatever is that for you, try matching it with a sound. It's actually really fun. And I find it's a great way to process whatever it is that we are feeling. And I think this is really important, all of this mindfulness work in this moment, because there's so many heightened feelings. There's so much anxiety and fear and anger out there. And so it becomes important that we stay in tune with those feelings and allow ourselves to process rather than repressing or recycling, which can lead to problems emotionally and psychologically. So my next lesson here is to choose to see the world through the lens of beauty. Over my years living in India, I could really feel myself becoming jaded. As I mentioned, I was surrounded by death and poverty on a daily basis. I was working in a really corrupt and broken government system. But one day I woke up and I realized that for every horrible thing that was happening around me, that there was something equally beautiful. All the people who had come together to help our mission, as I mentioned earlier. I would meet doctors who would stay up all night seeing patients out of the goodness of their hearts. And the most beautiful thing I got to see was the love a parent has for their child. I met moms who would sell all of their belongings to afford healthcare for their babies. Moms who slept on dirt floors outside of hospitals while their babies were kept in the NICU. And I realized through this experience that a parent will do anything to save their child, no matter how impoverished or uneducated or destitute some of these parents were. And it's the purest and most selfless form of love in the world. And it's the beauty that I get to see every day in my work. And so I think during this time, with all of this uncertainty and anxiety, and with all the doomsday of the press, how can we choose to see the world through the lens of beauty? And I think that will inspire us to keep wanting to change the world. And this is not to say to ignore the bad, but because our brains tend to fixate on the negative, or what's referred to as negativity bias, it's important to intentionally counterbalance that with the positive so that we can see the full picture. And research shows that goes a long way towards improving our well-being and our resilience. So my last lesson here is to choose to see every challenge as an ally. And here I wanted to end with my personal story and kind of the story behind the story. So I grew up in a home where there was a lot of domestic violence. My father was very physically abusive with me and my two sisters. And when I was 12, I had a really defining moment in my life. I decided to read my history book on the front lawn one day. And when my dad came home and saw this, something in him snapped. He must have had a bad day at work, but he decided that homework should not be done on the lawn. It should be done at a desk. And so he beat me up, and he demanded that I apologize for what I had done. And at 12, for the first time, I stood up to my father and I refused to apologize because I knew I had done nothing wrong. And so instead I said a prayer to God. I asked God to help me understand why this was happening. I didn't get my answer in that moment, but the gift of what happened in my childhood was that feeling so powerless and feeling so helpless inspired me to want to help the most powerless people in the world. And that led me to a career first doing HIV/AIDS work in China and Africa, and then spending the last 12 years of my life helping the most vulnerable beings in the world, who are these tiny premature infants. But the biggest challenge of my life came in 2018. We were going through an acquisition by a private equity firm. And 6 months after we started working on this deal, we had signed every piece of documentation this time, and we're literally just waiting for the wire transfer. The day the transfer was supposed to come, instead of getting the money, I got a call telling me that this private equity firm was shutting down. One of the founders had taken all of his money out for medical reasons, and they were shutting down the whole thing, which meant we would not have the funding to continue our work. This was 10 years into my journey, and I was beyond burned out. And this time I couldn't see a way out of it. We truly thought we were gonna have to shut down the company. Right as this was happening, a friend handed me a book about the power of prayer and mantra. I hadn't said a prayer since I was 12 years old, but I was desperate, and so I gave it a try. And I asked the universe to help us find a solution that would allow us to keep helping the moms and the babies that this product was intended for. I said this prayer over and over again over the course of the next few weeks, but it didn't seem to work yet again. And so Linus, my co-founder, kindly stepped back into the company to help me wind things down. And after that, I got myself a one-way ticket to Indonesia, where I wanted to surf and recuperate and regain my sanity. This was probably the worst time of my life. I was depressed. I was having panic attacks. It was just a really rough patch for me. And so right before leaving for Indonesia, I turned on Netflix one day and I stumbled across a film about Tony Robbins, the motivational speaker. The film's called I'm Not Your Guru, and it's about his event called Date with Destiny. And so I watched this film. I didn't know much about Tony at the time, but I watched this film and I'm just bawling from beginning to end. And at the end of it, I think to myself, gosh, I really want to go to this event, Date with Destiny. And so I write it down in my notebook and then I kind of forget about it. We're in the process of winding down the company. And then I leave for Indonesia. 3 weeks into my trip, completely out of the blue, I get a phone call from a man named Jonathan Cohen, who has become a dear friend. And Jonathan tells me, I work closely with Tony Robbins. Tony found out about Embrace and he'd like to make an investment and he'd like to invite you to Date with Destiny as his guest. Now, this is probably the most serendipitous thing that's ever happened to me. I still don't know how that all came to be. But what unfolded over the course of the next year was the most magical thing that's ever happened in my life. I attended Date with Destiny, attended multiple of Tony's conferences, and I got to just invest that whole year in my personal growth and my healing process. And I realized that my whole life, I had had this story that I wasn't enough, that I was the reason for my father's violence. And so it didn't matter how many babies I saved or how many degrees I got or how many accolades I won. I just never felt like I was enough. And through this healing process, I finally learned self-love and self-worth for the first time in my life. And I learned the most important lesson of my life, which is that I am inherently worthy of love, that I don't have to do anything to earn this love, that I am enough just as I am, just as all of us are. And the icing on the cake is that after telling Tony and his team what happened, they acquired the company as of last fall. Idea Lab New York, along with Tony Robbins, made that acquisition. And it's the best outcome that I could have ever asked for, because this is a team that is so dedicated to our mission to get our incubators to every baby who needs them. So I can't help but think that the universe was listening to my prayer after all. And now when I look back on my life, although I couldn't see it at the time, I can see now how this beautiful tapestry was being woven, and how the prayer I asked when I was 12 was actually answered, because what happened in my childhood laid the foundation for the purpose of my life. And now I see every challenge as an ally in helping me to understand love on an even deeper level. My father was my biggest ally in teaching me about love and compassion and forgiveness. And my company almost shutting down in 2018, well, that was my biggest ally in teaching me exactly the things I needed to learn for my personal growth and presenting us with the best possible outcome for this company. And so now the question I ask myself is, what can we learn given this unique set of circumstances, particularly through the time of this pandemic? And how can we think about this situation as an ally for our personal growth and for our collective growth as a society? And so I wanted to end here with this slide I often show. This is the Cathedral of Milan. The great cathedrals of Europe were built over centuries. The construction of this started in 1386 and was completed in 1965. And so often those who spent their whole lives working on these monuments never lived to see the results of their work, nor did their children, and sometimes even their grandchildren. So why did these people dedicate themselves so tirelessly to building these monuments? Well, I believe it's because they believed in a purpose that was far greater than themselves. And so I think particularly during this time, I think what's happened with COVID and more recently with George Floyd, all of this has really exposed the weaknesses and the fragilities of our system. And so can we take a step back and reimagine what we want society to look like? What is the cathedral that we want to build? And what is the legacy that we want to leave? So I'm going to end with a poem by Lynn Unger called Imagine. And I posted this on social media a few months ago, but I feel like this is so appropriate to everything happening right now. So imagine with me for a moment. Don't worry, I'm not saying it's real. Imagine, if you can, that there has been not a calamity, but a great awakening. Pretend just for a moment that we also loved our threatened Earth, that we stopped going on cruises, limited international flights. In this pretty fantasy, everyone who possibly can stops commuting, spends the extra time with their kids or their pets or their garden. We have the revelation that everyone needs healthcare, sick leave, steady work. The curse is that healthcare workers are heroes, also teachers, not to mention the artists of all kinds who teach us resilience and joy. Imagine, if you will, that we turn to our neighbors in mutual aid, trading eggs for milk, checking in on those who are elderly or alone. Imagine that each of us felt suddenly called to wonder, in this moment, what does the world need from me? What are my gifts? Yes, I know it's just a fantasy, The world can never change so radically overnight, but imagine. So I will end there, but thank you guys so much for joining today. And if you have any questions for me, I'm happy to answer.
Yeah, Jane, there were a few questions, but people can just unmute themselves and just ask it directly, since I count 5, so I think that's good enough to manage on our own. So I think.
Okay. Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, Peter, you want to go first?
My question actually seems pretty mundane and shallow at this point, because there's Astro in the presentation. So I'll defer to other people.
Okay. Well, we can go back to you. Melanie, you want to go?
Okay, just had to unmute.
It's good. It's so good to see you. Thanks for joining.
Thank you. So I was just kind of thinking about how your experience has been different from Stanford, and other than like doing really inspiring things, which many of us have not, but very inspirational. And one thing that's unique about your story is I think most of us have jumped jobs a few times at this point. And so as you progress as a leader, like there's a niceness to that of a clean slate, because those mistakes we make right out of business school, you know, it's definitely a learning path, and you were probably better at it than most of us. But for me, it was a big learning path. And so sometimes just changing roles and companies gave you a way to like refresh that. So where you've been with your same team in the same company this entire time, I'm curious how you gave each other room to progress, like to forgive each other for mistakes, to become better leaders. Yeah, like just kind of like, how did you give each other room to grow?
Oh, thanks. That's such a great question. Well, I feel like there's been multiple stages of the company. And so each of those stages, I've learned something totally new. Like I felt like when we launched the consumer product company, I moved back to the US at that time. We had to form a whole new company in the US that was a totally new market. You know, it was nice to be able to do consumer research in English. Like it was a totally different thing. You know, we were selling to affluent parents as opposed to really bottom of the pyramid. And so I feel like just the evolution of the company did allow for that in and of itself. But I think in terms of team dynamics, and Linus, you can chime in here as well. I have to say that one of the most helpful classes at the GSB was touchy-feely. And it was awesome because Linus had also taken this class. And for those who are not familiar, this is a class called Interpersonal Dynamics at Stanford that is commonly referred to as touchy-feely. But Linus had taken that class separately as an engineer. And so we had a common language. And that really allowed us to set that culture within the founding team. There are many, many intense discussions throughout. And every time we faced a challenge, you know, there was a lot of conflict within the leadership team, different views of what should happen. But I think allowing ourselves kind of that open communication and transparency and being really forgiving with each other. I feel like I made so many mistakes as a leader. And I was so lucky to have someone like Linus and the rest of the team by my side who could you know, help me work through those and not hold those over my head. And so I think a lot of it does come down to team dynamics, and then also forgiving yourself. I think we have these really loud inner critics. I know I certainly do. And it's sometimes been harder to forgive myself, but just realizing that everything, as I said, is an ally to our personal growth. Every failure, every setback, that's just another learning opportunity. And so if we can not be so judgmental with ourselves, but forgive, right? Then that allows for that opening for learning and for our own evolution. And I think that's the biggest piece for me, is learning that self-compassion and that self-forgiveness. Thank you for asking that question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Cesar, do you want to go?
Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing your story. It's amazing to hear. Maybe I can wrap my 2 questions into one.
Sure.
Do you hear me?
Yeah. So nice to see you, by the way, but yeah.
It's like 10 years. Yeah, so the question is, so now that you had all these challenges and, you know, successes at the same time as well, and then you feel that you made an ally of those challenges, what are you afraid of? The second question is, what do you feel that is exciting to you what is worthy you feel of your energy and dedication? And that kind of leads to the question of like, what's next for you and why? I know it's a lot of questions at the same time. Sorry.
Thanks for asking that. Like, it's a lot of folks I haven't seen in so many years. It's really awesome to see you guys. I think what I'm really excited about is what's next for the company. We have a few new people joining, including Jeff and Jane, who are on the call, and they're just some of the most incredible human beings I've met. And so I feel so lucky that we've been able to recruit new people and new energy into the team. And we're kind of in the process of figuring out what's next post-acquisition, how we relaunch our consumer product business. As I said, a lot of this was like pivot so many times to figure out what is the right business model for this. You know, we're trying to sell a low cost, low margin product to the poorest people in the world. How do we scale this? How do we make this financially feasible? And so I think with the new team on board, it really gives us an opportunity to do that. And so that's where part of my energy is going. And then I've just really been interested in kind of the personal journey, as I mentioned, and this theme of resilience and what gives us resilience. It's just been very recently that I've started doing this kind of speaking and opening up about my personal story, which I had never done. You know, many of my closest friends didn't even know about that personal story. And so I'm in the process of writing a book, and yeah, excited to share that with the world. And that the theme of that is really, you know, how do we find that intrinsic sense of self-love and self-worth? And I think that's, as I said, particularly important in the time like this, where outcomes are really uncertain. You know, we don't know what the future is going to hold. And so we can't rely on those external outcomes to define who we are. But I think also in this world that we live in today of social media, you know, where our self-worth is defined by how many likes we get on Instagram and whatnot. Again, I think it becomes more important to look at who we are internally and what we stand for. And so that's kind of been where a lot of my thinking is, more in this wellness and mental health space. And that's something I want to dedicate.
Do you mind if I have a follow-up question? Thanks a lot for your answer. But I imagine like seeing, you know, babies dying is like, it's so powerful that it really pulls you in, and it's almost like you have no choices but to keep doing that work because it's so important.
Yeah.
And now that you have done this work, but other people are joining, do you make plans for yourself for the long term, or do you just live kind of day by day and you're just trying to do what you feel is necessary? Because now you've had, I don't know if you anticipated to work on like a 10 or 15 years almost like project. That's such a big chunk.
Yeah.
And you know that it takes time to get something done. So do you feel that you want to commit yourself to something new, or do you feel that that's your life call and you're going to be doing that? Or
I think I'll always stay involved in Embrace in some capacity. And you're right, it's so funny. When I read back on our original business plans, it's like we thought we could, you know, save millions of babies in a few years. Like, it's hilarious to me what we had thought at the time. You know, 12 years into that journey, we're like at the tip of the iceberg. Like, I had no idea how long this would take. And so, yeah, this has been, you know, a labor of love. It's been 12 years, and I'll always stay involved in some capacity, but I really feel good now that we have, you know, the product in place, we have the infrastructure in place, and now especially under new ownership and leadership, that we have the ability for this to move on without me having to be involved so much on an operational role. So I feel really, really good about that. And that's what I hoped for all along. And so that, you know, when I take a step back and I think about some of the core issues in our society, and this touches on what I said earlier, but I really believe it's people acting from a place of fear rather than love. And when I look at violence, wars, you know, so much of what's happening in society today, when you can boil it down to kind of one thing, one core root cause, that's what I think it is. And I think that acting from a place of love requires having self-love. And so many of the things I've worked on in my career, I do feel are a symptom of this larger problem. And this is a really big one to tackle, but it's something that I want to start putting more of my energy into, because I've seen what a difference that's made in my life personally.
Thanks.
Yeah. Let's see. I don't know if there's another question out there, but feel free to jump in.
I got one, Jane.
Yeah, please.
Was there anything you learned in business school that you had to like unlearn to be successful in real life?
That's such a good question. I love it. I don't know know if there's anything I had to unlearn. It wasn't so much a business school, but I think it was like what I touched upon earlier about vulnerability. Like I had this image in my head going into this of what a CEO should look like and act like. And it was like a very masculine approach to leadership. And I don't think that's something we explicitly learn in business school, but that was just like this impression that I had built up through all these books I'd read and, you know, the images that I had seen in the media. And what I learned was that isn't real leadership, and that like having that vulnerability allows for such deeper connection with the team. And so that's been totally new for me, because my whole life, like I had a lot of trouble being vulnerable, right? Vulnerability was scary to me. And so just learning to flex that muscle, that's been entirely new for me. And I've seen the more I can do that, the more I can be real with my team and express my emotions, allow others to do the same. I think that creates for a much stronger culture. The other thing I would say, coming back to business school, is I kind of marvel at how little time we spend at business school on HR and human resources and culture, which I think is the most important thing in an organization. Now, having built this organization, and as founders, we spent a lot of time thinking through what are the values, what's our mission. And then how do we reinforce those values throughout? How do we hire people who have exemplified those values? How do we reward based on those values? And all of that, the culture and the values, that becomes the true north of the organization. And so often when we were debating something, we would go back to that, and then that would guide us back in the right direction. And so that is something I ended up spending a lot of my time on at Embrace. And I feel like we almost didn't discuss any of that in business school. And I am surprised by that. And so that's something I think a lot about as well, is just how do we set the right culture? And that comes back to my question of like, what are our values? How do we embody those values? And then I think the outcomes will follow.
Cool.
I had a question, Jane.
Yeah, hey, nice to see you.
Yeah. So nice meeting you after 2 years, I think, yeah. My question was, how did you get the courage to, after business school, the four of you, how did you get the courage to leave everything and move to India to start this? Did you have anything working before you even decided to make that move?
Yeah. That's a good question. I don't know if it was courage or stupidity. It was certainly being naive. And Sarani, she worked with us in India. She was one of our product designers. And so I'm so glad you're joining us today. But at that point, it was my second year in school, Embrace. I had done the class I had taken my first year. And Linus actually was a big part of this. So he was the one who kept the team together. He had applied to this elevator pitch competition in our second year and won $2,000. And so with that money, we started applying to other business plan competitions throughout the course of my second year. And I think we lost almost all of them. We didn't win any money, but I didn't have another job ready. I had just decided that this was what I was going to do. And so it wasn't until the day before we graduated that we won the Echoing Green Fellowship, and then we won the Stanford Basis competition. And that gave us our first, I think, $130,000 in funding. And the Echoing Green Fellowship required that you commit at least 2 years to doing this. And so that's kind of when it became serious. And we thought, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to commit 2 years to this. And then, going to India, it's funny how little debate there was about it. It wasn't even a discussion. It was just, we had learned at the design school that in order to create great products, you want to be close to your customers and you want to be on the ground. And the only way for us to do that was to be there, to be at the epicenter of the problem. And so I don't even know if we had a discussion about that. We decided we were just going to pack our bags and leave. Of course, I thought I'd be there for about a year, and a year turned into 4 years. But at that point, it was just, Linus and I, Rahul and I had committed to the Echoing Green Fellowship. And Linus was doing a startup in the tech space, but he lived down the street from me. And so as I was working on Embrace, I'd go to a coffee shop every day, and Linus would come and do his work there. And he saw me dedicating myself so much to it that he said, you know what, I'm going to quit my tech job and I'm going to come join you guys. And so he did. He became part of the team. I remember we would take conference calls in my car. That was our little conference room. We bring our little setup to the coffee shop. And then Nog joined us as well. And so one by one, we kind of all decided to just do it and jump and go all in. And so it wasn't like a snap decision. It kind of evolved over time. But I have to say, I'm so grateful for having co-founders, because that really, I think, gave us each the courage to move forward with this. And we often talk about like just the commitment. I don't think it was that we had the best idea to do this necessarily, but we were really committed, and we were each willing to sacrifice a lot to get Embrace off the ground. And so I think it's really that effort, that intention, that commitment that allowed us to do the things that we did. And then people like you, of course, talented people like you who joined our team.
For all of you, I can vouch for whatever Jane has been talking about for setting culture and values in the company. I think that made so much difference for all of us. Thanks, Jane.
Yeah, of course. Cool. Anything else before we wrap up?
So I have a quick comment, Jane.
Yeah.
I haven't seen you in like 20 years.
I know, so nice.
Yeah, I mean, everything that you've said is so inspiring, and I was about to cry. But I work with kids, and I've recently just gotten my credential to teach special ed. But I was just thinking, I'm like, what an amazing story to be able to share with the youth of today. I'm like, would you ever consider being like a guest speaker or an inspirational speaker for kids?
Of course. Oh my gosh, I love talking to students, because I feel like that's the right time to share this message and to be able to influence them at that age. So absolutely, I never say no to speaking to students. So if you want to reach out to me separately, we can schedule something.
Absolutely, because I think, I mean, you've got so many different layers. You've got your talk about like how important failure is to the whole success of life, and vulnerability, and just understanding other cultures. I think those are such important things in this time and age. So
yeah,
thank you so much for sharing.
Oh, thank you for the work that you're doing. And let's connect separately. Awesome. Any last thoughts or questions as we wrap up?
Peter, I think, had a question, but I feel bad I like monopolizing the questions.
No, go for it.
So if Peter is not gonna, Peter, are you sure it's okay for me to ask a question? Because you had a question about IP.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I mean, I can ask we'll go ahead.
Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just curious about your opinions on open source versus proprietary development of IP for emerging markets. Like, I've had mixed results with both, and I'm still not sure which is the best approach to try to scale a product. Like, if you're starting out and you're trying to make those decisions, I really respect what you did with IP with Embrace. It was very unique, the way you structured the multiple companies.
Yeah.
And,
that's a great question. I would love to get your thoughts on this, Peter. But for us, I think what was tricky, I think it depends on if you plan to raise capital, right? And kind of the potential for profitability, because we thought we struggled with this question a lot as well, but because we knew we wanted to bring in investors, they required that we have a patent, and and so that was a big part of that decision. And I would have to say, looking back on this 12 years later, what was great about that decision is that it allowed us to license the IP later, because it would have been so hard for us to do this on our own. We were eventually able to license that IP to a company called Phoenix Medical Systems, and they specialize specifically in manufacturing neonatal equipment for developing countries. So without that patent in place, we wouldn't have been able to license. That being said, I think if there isn't a commercial interest and this were to be done just as a nonprofit, then the open source model, absolutely. So it just depends on kind of what is your strategy to scaling that technology, and is there a commercialization process involved in that? And I have to say, for me personally, as much as I believe in nonprofits, I do believe there is a limitation, and that profitability and scalability in my mind go hand in hand. And so if there is a for-profit model, I always encourage people to explore that path. And then if there really isn't a market for it, then I think the nonprofit model makes sense. did that answer your question, Peter? And I'm like,
Oh yeah, definitely.
okay, awesome. Cool, Cesar, do you want to ask your last question before we wrap?
Okay, thanks very much. Oh, so go ahead.
Oh, sorry, maybe Jane, this is Rex. I think we met last year at Moderist.
Yeah.
Can you share a little more about, you mentioned you're writing a book. Can you maybe share a little more about what your plans are in that book and maybe some of the things that you plan to do in the next year or so?
Yeah. Yeah, this is just something that I've taken on as a passion project. And so the book is it's about the journey of embrace. It's about the personal journey. And as I said, it's kind of that, the personal story around what does it mean to find that innate sense of self-love and self-worth. And so this is probably a year out. I just finished my proposal. I'm talking to some agents and see, but I've kind of just, learned to, I don't know, the way I'm thinking about life right now is to just let things happen, let things unfold. This is something I unlearned from business school probably, instead of like setting these hard targeting goals and going after them. I'm more all about setting my intentions and then letting the path unfold for me. So a lot is unknown and I feel really good being in that space.
What's the co-founder? I think Linux, he's one of the co-founders of Embrace.
Linus is here at this call. He's one of the co-founders, but there are 4 of us that I showed in that initial photo. Yeah. Cesar, do you want to ask your last question?
Sorry. So you don't have to answer if it's too personal, but like you've dedicated such a big part of your life to this. Like, do you feel that it cost your relationship, or did you push your family project further, or was it part of your plan, or is it your next biggest project?
That's a really good question. I'm putting it all out there anyways. I'm happy to answer. Yeah, I think I made a lot of personal sacrifices, and Embrace was like, that's all I could think about. I just worked on this night and day for years. And so I didn't really have time for personal life. And that was a decision I made. I don't blame the company. That was a decision that I consciously made. And like I said, I'm so grateful for the things that I've learned in this journey. But yeah, of course, I would love to proceed with other aspects of my life, which I've had way more of an opportunity to do now. And now I'm just kind of seeing what unfolds in front of me without an urgency to have to get anywhere. And it's been really nice. And that's been a big part of my mindfulness practice, is like, how do I just enjoy the beauty of this very moment, right? And it's so hard to do that without getting caught up in what's happened in the past or what we hope happens in the future. But I find that I'm the happiest when I can just be with whatever's in front of me right now.
Thanks.
Cool. Well, it's so awesome to see your beautiful faces, and thank you again for joining. And I hope I get to see all of you again very soon. And yeah, I would love to stay in touch. Oh, I'm starting a newsletter. This is all very new for me, and just kind of sharing these personal learnings that I'm coming across. And so if you guys want to sign up for that, it's on my website, janemariechen.com. And yeah, I love you guys all. So hope to be in touch soon. And thank you for all these wonderful questions. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Jane.
Thank you.